lived in Massachusetts, I spent some of my extra time earning extra money by working as a substitute teacher for the Gloucester School District, which is where the movie The Perfect Storm was set. I usually taught kindergarten or first grade and especially enjoyed the little accents that the little kids had perfected in so little time. "Mr. Omli, I'm wicked good at making sea stars." "Yes, you are, Hannah. Yes, you are." I received a call early one morning from the middle school to see if I could substitute for a science teacher who had called in sick. So I arrived in the classroom and found a note from the teacher indicating that DNA was the topic for the day. So I Googled DNA to give myself a quick refresher course before the kids arrived. And after using the term deoxyribonucleic acid for a second time, one of the kids asked, "Wait, you like a scientist or something?" "Why, yes I am," I said, "but I don't study genetics. I study sports psychology." There were a trio of boys in the back of the room who had been whispering to each other, and suddenly one of them perked up and said, "Wait, you can study sport in college?" "Yes, you can," I replied. And one of his friends got a really serious expression on his face and whispered, "I want to go to college. So if I do nothing else in life, there's that." Another kid asked me what sports psychologists studied. So I explained that I was doing my master's thesis on stress and sport performance, looking at how anxiety and arousal influence performance of a tennis serve. And I asked the class, "How do you think being really sluggish or being really amped up or somewhere in between would influence your performance in a sport like tennis or basketball?" And a girl on my left, dressed head to toe in full goth, made an inverted U with her finger. And that just goes to show how intuitive the inverted U hypothesis is. After a few researchers considered the drive hypothesis proposed by Hull in 1954 and Spence in 1966, the inverted U became the dominant paradigm. The inverted U hypothesis of the stress-performance relationship is actually an adaptation of the inverted U relationship between habit strength and performance in a maze task in mice that was discovered by Yerkes and Dodson in 1908. But the adaptation to sport by Dan Landers in 1970 suggests that the relationship between performance and arousal can be described graphically by an inverted U shape. The hypothesis suggests that if you are under-aroused, you won't perform very well, and if you are over-aroused, you won't perform very well either. But if you approach some ideal state in the middle, you are more likely to perform at your best. Reasonable enough, eh? Well, researchers have had a heck of a time trying to get data to support the hypothesis. And when they have come close, it is usually in carefully controlled lab studies with questionable external validity. So researchers have tried to think of different, more complex hypotheses. For example, Martins, Veely, and Burton in 1990 suggested that the relationship between stress and sport performance needed a bit of nuancing. So instead of a single arousal independent variable, they proposed 3 separate independent variables that might come together to account for variations in outcome performance variable. They hypothesized a linear relationship between self-confidence and sport performance, an inverse relationship between cognitive anxiety and sport performance, and an inverted U relationship between somatic anxiety and sport performance. Cognitive anxiety involves anxious thoughts, cognitive as in cognos or mind, and somatic anxiety involves anxious feelings, somatic as in soma or body. And though the inverted U is still integral to the theory, there's still very little research support. And the multidimensional anxiety theory also had the problem of dynamic synthesis. How would the 3 predictor variables combine to influence sport performance? Around the same time, the mathematician turned sports psychologist Lou Hardy used some elaborate mathematical models to explain the relationship between stress and sport performance. Hardy adapted the cusp catastrophe model, which is one of several elementary catastrophes identified by the French mathematician René Thom in the late 1970s. Okay, warning. The next several minutes are rated N for nerdy. Catastrophe theory provides a method for describing phenomena that are normally continuous but become discontinuous under certain control parameters. More technically, catastrophe theory describes the way in which attractors occasion changes in structurally stable forms. A form, by the definition stipulated by René Thom in 1975, stays fundamentally the same. In theory, the water that fills a jar is structurally stable. In practice, however, the water is influenced by factors such as the ambient temperature and air pressure, which are not entirely stable or controllable. Nonetheless, catastrophe theory, at least in theory, is conceptually robust enough to endure small violations of assumptions of structurally stable forms. Catastrophe theory, however, cannot endure more severe structural instability. Catastrophe theory cannot account for the morphogenesis of a human being, let alone human consciousness. Humans are too internally chaotic and are thus not structurally stable. No offense. So almost any application of the catastrophe theory to human behavior would be a misapplication. The cusp catastrophe model of sport performance violates the fundamental assumptions of catastrophe theory, as well as fundamental assumptions of the cusp catastrophe model itself. René Thom described his work as a theory of analogies, and described catastrophe theory as qualitative mathematics. Think about that for a moment. But as René Thom mused in 1975, at a time when so many scholars are calculating, isn't it desirable that some who can dream? So just for fun, let's look at Hardy's application of the cusp catastrophe model to sport performance. First, Hardy proposed an inverted U relationship between physiological arousal, or the normal factor, and sport performance. Second, he suggested that the relationship between physiological arousal and sport performance changes under conditions of elevated cognitive anxiety, the splitting factor. Rather than a two-dimensional graph, the cusp catastrophe model is displayed graphically as a three-dimensional performance surface. Change is continuous when anxiety is low, but under conditions of high anxiety, a catastrophe or dramatic change in performance is likely. So the cusp catastrophe model has some intuitive appeal because it can account for why some Olympic athletes can set world records when the pressure is on, but others seem to fall apart completely. Because high anxiety coupled with high arousal can bring out the best and the worst performances. Another important prediction of the cusp catastrophe model is what Thom and Hardy called the hysteresis effect, which means that after performance has fallen to the lower performance surface, physiological arousal or cognitive anxiety need to decrease dramatically for the athlete to return to the upper performance surface. So changes in performance will follow a different path depending on the direction of the change in physiological arousal or cognitive anxiety. Hardy and colleagues found some research support for the hysteresis effect and polarized performance, but they were nowhere near acquiring data that would match the bifurcated performance surfaces predicted by the model. Conducting research guided by the cusp catastrophe model is challenging due to the complexity of the model itself, but also due to the assumptions of the model and the assumptions made when submitting data to statistical analyses. The researcher who wishes to test predictions of the cusp catastrophe model is in a bit of a quandary when choosing a statistical model. Because an ANOVA tests differences between means, the statistical analyses could potentially control for important predictors such as concentration, confidence, and motivation that are excluded from the underlying model, if these variables could be assessed accurately. However, an ANOVA or even a MANCOVA cannot account for the nonlinear trends predicted by the cusp catastrophe model. A second option would be to use a regression analysis. An ideal regression model is one that contains only predictor variables that are highly correlated with the outcome variable and are relatively uncorrelated with one another. A fundamental assumption of the cusp catastrophe model is that two predictor variables influence a third outcome variable almost exclusively. If a third or fourth variable were important predictors of the outcome variable, then a more complex elementary catastrophe would be substituted for the cusp catastrophe model in order to more adequately explain the nonlinear dynamics that influence the outcome variable of sport performance. Thus, the cusp catastrophe model of sport performance assumes that performance is predicted by physiological arousal and cognitive anxiety, and that other constructs such as concentration, confidence, and motivation are essentially unrelated to sport performance. To be a bit more technical, this is a problem because the influence of excluded predictor variables on included predictor variables would increase the likelihood of a type 1 error. And the included variables would be too highly correlated to allow for anything but a profoundly misspecified regression model. If a researcher is willing to assume that physiological arousal and cognitive anxiety explain sport performance almost exclusively, then the cusp catastrophe model remains an adequate guide for his or her research. But if he or she believes that constructs such as concentration, confidence, and motivation are also important, then the researcher is likely to search for a new paradigm. So what do we do? Just keep banging our head against the wall while chanting, "If at first you don't succeed, try again"? Maybe, if that's what you're into. But another option would be to learn from history. Or to be more specific, the history of science as articulated by Thomas Kuhn. Thomas Kuhn was a Harvard scholar who turned the world upside down with his 1962 book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which introduced the concept of a paradigm shift. The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which is an absolute must-read for every grad student, challenged the popular notion that science is a clean, cumulative process which inevitably leads to additional knowledge through new discoveries. Kuhn described science as a little bit messy, often heading down the wrong road, and sometimes hampered by ideas held too tightly by human beings who are, after all, human. Kuhn used the example of a geocentric universe to explain his observations. Even when astronomers believed that the planets revolved around the Earth, they were able to correctly predict some celestial events, but often needed incredibly complex mathematics to explain their predictions or describe planetary motion. However, in other cases they were simply stumped. Their astronomy didn't conform to reality. The reason being, of course, we know now, is that the Earth and other planets in our solar system revolve around the Sun. When experiments and other forms of puzzle solving, which Kuhn called normal science, don't work out, scientists often blame their methods for their failure to disconfirm the null hypothesis. But after enough anomalies accumulate, sometimes over a long period of time, Kuhn noticed that sometimes a sudden shift will take place, whereby assumptions that were once assumed to be true are challenged, usually by somebody fairly new to the field, and data are collected that confirm the old paradigm was wrong. Kuhn called this sort of event a scientific revolution, and observed that, like political revolutions, scientific revolutions are messy, almost violent events where feelings are hurt and loyalties are tested. But once a revolution takes place and normal science begins accumulating the support for the new theory, the way people see the phenomenon changes quickly and dramatically, and the world is never quite the same. This is what Kuhn called a paradigm shift. To illustrate the way in which a paradigm shift immediately changes the way we look at the world, imagine that the most respected person in your hometown was exposed by some scandal. If you believe the allegations to be true, this new knowledge would transform the way you thought of that person's future actions, but it would also immediately change your perceptions of their past behavior as well. Likewise, a paradigm shift in science transforms the way scientists interpret new observations, but it also causes scientists to reinterpret previous findings and experiences. Kuhn pointed to several paradigm shifts. The germ theory of disease is one example. The localization of brain function is another. And of course, the Copernican revolution. After the Copernican revolution and the geocentric to heliocentric paradigm shift took place, everything changed and it became almost impossible to see the world in the same way. So the stages of a scientific revolution, according to Kuhn, are as follows. First, the pre-paradigm stage, which has no agreed upon theory, even if scientific experiments are being conducted. Second, the normal science stage, which involves puzzle solving through experimentation and other forms of empirical research. Third, a crisis ensues due to repeated failures of normal science guided by the old paradigm and the accumulation of anomalous findings. Fourth, the scientific revolution occurs, whereby assumptions of the old paradigm are questioned and a new paradigm gains traction. And fifth, the post-revolution, in which the new paradigm becomes dominant and scientists return to puzzle solving and the work of normal science. Kuhn's theory has been extremely influential, but it has also been extremely controversial, due in large part to criticism that the theory promoted scientific relativism. Kuhn answered his critics by reminding them, as he had stated in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, that theory choices made by scientists are usually guided by 5 criteria. First, that the theory is accurate in terms of what it theorized and what is actually observed, using what philosophers call a correspondence theory of truth. Second, the theory is consistent within itself and externally consistent with related theories. Third, the theory has a broad scope and is able to explain more than the phenomenon that the theory was originally meant to explain. Fourth, the theory is simple, as famously suggested by William of Ockham, who argued that the most parsimonious explanation for a phenomenon is usually the right one. This thought is known as Occam's razor. And fifth, the theory should be fruitful, both in terms of helping us understand the phenomenon itself and its relationship to other phenomena. With the exception of the inverted U hypothesis being parsimonious and intuitive, the stress sport performance paradigm does not satisfy the other 4 criteria. It does not appear to be accurate, consistent, broad, or particularly fruitful. The amount of research focused on the relationship between stress and sport performance has declined over the past 15 or so years, but in the previous 3 decades, plenty of unimpressive findings accumulated in scholarly journals, conference proceedings, and master's theses by puzzle solvers doing normal science. But in addition to the normal science that has been published, there's probably quite a few experiments that have been conducted but the results of which have not been published. The reason being, it is difficult to get papers published when the theory or hypothesis is not confirmed. This is called the file drawer effect, and it is a perplexing problem for philosophers of science. But the inverted U hypothesis still has this intuitive appeal. So much so that a 13-year-old goth girl in Massachusetts can more or less come up with it on her own. And that may be why the field has been so slow to escape from the shadow of the inverted U. But the fact remains that research supporting the inverted U hypothesis and its more complex descendants is still limited at best. Now, it may be that the stress sport performance paradigm just attracted researchers who were unlucky or unskilled in the ways of science. Or it may be that the stress sport performance paradigm is fundamentally flawed. Maybe the question, how does stress influence sport performance, isn't one that has a clear, meaningful answer waiting to be discovered. At least not one that would provide actionable intelligence for practitioners and coaches. Maybe the stress sport performance paradigm has actually held back our understanding of sport performance and our understanding of why some physically similar athletes tend to perform better than others, and why a particular athlete might perform well during one competition and fall apart in another. After all, that is why scientists investigated the relationship between stress and sport performance in the first place. But maybe, just maybe, the field of sports psychology is due for a paradigm shift, or at least a true paradigm. And if such a shift is to occur, Kuhn would predict that it would involve a scientist in his or her 20s or early 30s, because most scientific revolutions have been initiated by those who have not yet been fully initiated into the current paradigm. Because a paradigm's most ardent proponents have a particularly tough time seeing outside the paradigm. In Kuhnian terms, the field of sports psychology, particularly the segments focused on the psychology of sport performance, is in a pre-paradigm phase. Yes, some sports psychology research is theory-driven, especially in the area of motivation. But unlike the field of psychology with its major schools of thought, psychoanalysis, Gestalt, behaviorism, and so on, there is no grand and parsimonious theory of the psychology of sport performance that drives research and informs practice. So for young researchers and practitioners, let not your heart be troubled by the lack of actionable intelligence coming out of the stress sport performance paradigm. Instead, be encouraged by the exciting work of revolutionary science yet to be conducted, and maybe you can be a part of it. Or maybe it will be one of my middle school students from Gloucester.